I'll be the first to say that all of this could have just been going on in my head. The mind is a whole different thing, and it can actually play some pretty trippy tricks on you. Whenever I was scared as a kid, my dad always told me that in life, you shouldn't be scared of a ghost or some other paranormal things. If anything, he said to fear the living, because they can actually hurt you. When I was a teenager, I came into some money after my father committed suicide, and I basically received everything from him. At the time of my dad's passing, he and my mom owned a cabin up in Oregon. The cabin had been put up for sale since my mom could no longer afford the payments, and renting it out was not covering the payments. The cabin was set to go on the market for sale in less than a month, and it was in the process of finalizing the paperwork with all the parties. So during that time, the cabin was not going to be rented out any longer, and it was actually going to be vacant. I saw this as a chance to get away and clear my head in light of all the things going on. I actually quit work. I packed up my snowboarding gear, grabbed my dog Midnight, and headed up in my dad's car to the cabin. This was our family cabin that my parents would actually rent out throughout the year when nobody was using it. I had keys to the cabin, and I also had the code for the alarm, so I didn't feel the need to stop at the rental management company and tell them about my stay. This has nothing to do with the coming story, but I feel like I needed to mention it anyway. My first 2 days at the cabin were normal, and nothing really happened. I spent my days playing with my dog in the snow, snowboarding, and the evenings playing PlayStation or listening to music, drinking and smoking out in the balcony. I had already stocked up on food, cigarettes, and liquor, so I was pretty much locked down in the cabin from the occasional out to hit the slopes. With my dog as company and my PlayStation as entertainment, I was quite satisfied and started to feel relaxed. The cabin itself was 2 stories. The bottom story had the living room and a guest bedroom on the side along with a small kitchen. Upstairs were the other 2 rooms along with a walkout balcony that was attached to the master bedroom. Most of my time there was spent in the living room, the kitchen, or the master bedroom. I never ventured into the other rooms and always kept the doors leading into them shut. Open doors to dark rooms always creep me out, by the way. Anyways, the 3rd day came around, and I was going through my usual routine of playing with my dog. His name was Midnight, by the way, and he's passed since then, so I was just playing games and watching movies. On that day, it was pretty heavy snowfall, so I did not feel like trekking down the hill to the main road. That's when things started getting a bit weird. In our area, there were only 2 other cabins around, maybe a block away from each other. Every other cabin aside from these 2 were around a mile away from ours. Surrounding us was mostly forest and very tall pine trees. Yes, they were tall, and this is actually important for the story. Most of these cabins were empty, and from the past couple of days, I knew that no one was currently staying there. So enough background, I'm gonna jump to the weirdness. Around midday, I was outside with my dog when I noticed what looked like footprints in the snow. They were around the area surrounding our cabin. It was still snowing, so the footprints looked sort of fresh, like if someone had been there in the last 20 to 30 minutes before me. I thought that maybe somebody was staying in the cabin near me, and maybe I didn't notice. Maybe they were shut-ins like me. Alright, whatever. The footprints led away from my cabin, and they disappeared in the snow towards the denser part of the trees. I ignored the footprints and went back inside. When the nighttime came around, I decided to head to bed. My dog Midnight was laying on the bed with me when I noticed his ears perk up. This was followed by him quickly jumping off the bed and running downstairs. I laid in bed and stayed silent. I was kind of freaked out, I'm not gonna lie. I could hear him moving around downstairs back and forth. After around 5 minutes, he ran back upstairs to me and started to do his doggy dance for the sign that he had to go pee, or that he wanted to just go outside. Well, fine, I can't say no to him, so we both went downstairs to the outside driveway for him to do his thing. Except, he didn't want to pee. As soon as we were outside, he started to pull, trying to drag me to where he wanted to go. He kept looking into the dense part of the trees where the prints had been earlier, but he also kept sniffing the side of the house and looking up towards the roof. After he figured out that I wasn't going to go to where he wanted, he sat himself down and just stared into the darkness. A bit strange for him, but alright. Maybe there's forest animals out there that he wants to chase down. But fuck this. I didn't want to chance anything. So I pulled him back inside and we both headed back upstairs. Around half an hour later, I was lying in bed when I heard what sounded like hoofs walking on my roof. It was only a series of around 6 steps, and I told myself it could have been a pine cone falling from a tree onto the roof, or maybe a kind of hearted forest animal running around. But here's the thing. The steps seemed to be spaced apart, like that of a man. Well, a person. So it was really freaking me out. Midnight also heard the noise and was quick to run to the balcony screen door, expecting for me to let him out. Alright, you know what? I'm a tough guy, and at that time I considered myself to be fairly well built and strong enough to handle myself. So I grabbed my coat and shoes along with my cigarettes and flashlight and went out into the balcony. Fuck it. As soon as I was outside, I lit up my cigarette and started looking to the roof with my light. Nothing there. And the snow on top of it was undisturbed. Weird. It must have been all in my head. But what about Midnight hearing the noise? Maybe he was feeding off my fear. I started to calm down and relax again. By the way, I'm literally shaking right now. And my heart is beating fast as I'm remembering all of this. My eyes started to adjust to the darkness, and I kept smoking and just staring at the stars and trees next to our cabin. That's when I saw it. In a tree that was a little taller than our cabin, and around 20 feet from the balcony, I saw what looked like a man. He was crouching down in a squatting position, in between 2 branches. It looked really tall, like 8 or 9 foot, and it was really fucking skinny. It was squatted on one branch, and it was very long. Wide arms were extended above its head, holding onto the branch above it, while its mouth was wide open with no expression. Fuck me. I wasn't sure if I was really seeing this thing, and I stood there just staring and sat there motionless. I noticed Midnight stand up, and he started pacing behind me, and also lightly barking at the same time. This thing still didn't move. I put my cigarette out and was debating on shining the light in the thing's direction, but something in my head kept screaming not to. So I just walked backwards to the inside of the room, and I pulled Midnight inside with me. Once inside, I locked the door and shined the light in the thing's direction, but there was nothing there. I shut the curtains to the screen door and retreated back to bed, but later on in the night, I heard some light tapping at the screen door, like someone was tapping on the glass with their fingers. It was consistent, and it didn't stop for nearly an hour. Midnight seemed to stare at the door, but he wouldn't go near it. The weirdest thing out of all of this is that I had a feeling like someone was inviting me to open the door, but at the same time, I kept hearing my dad's voice in my head telling me to stay in bed and not do it. I decided to listen to my dad's voice and just stay where I was. I passed out eventually and woke up in the morning. It didn't take me long to pack everything and get the fuck out of there. About 5 years ago, I lived in downtown in a major city in the US. I always been a night person. I would often find myself bored after my roommate, who was actually not a night person, went to sleep. To pass time, I used to go for long walks and spend the time thinking. I spent 4 years like that, walking alone at night. I never once had a reason to feel afraid. I always used to joke with my roommate that even the drug dealers in the city were polite. But all of that changed in just a few minutes of this one night. It was Wednesday, somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning, and I was walking near a police patrol park quite a ways from my apartment. It was a quiet night, even for a weeknight, with very little traffic and almost no one on foot. The park, as it was most nights, was empty. I turned down a short side street in order to loop back to my apartment when I first noticed him. At the far end of the street, on my side, was the silhouette of a man, dancing. It was a strange dance, similar to a waltz, but he would finish the box with an odd stride. I guess you could say he was dance walking, and he was headed straight for me. Deciding that he was most likely drunk, I stepped as close as I could to the road to give him the majority of the sidewalk to pass me by. The closer he got, the more I realized how gracefully he was moving. He was very tall and lanky, and he was wearing an old suit. He danced closer still, until I could make out his face. His eyes were open wide. His head was tilted back slightly, looking off at the sky. His mouth was forming a painfully wide cartoon of a smile. I decided to cross the street before he danced any closer. I took my eyes off of him to cross the empty street. As I reached the other side, I glanced back, and then stopped dead in my tracks. He had stopped dancing and was standing with one foot in the street, perfectly parallel to me. He was facing me but still looking up, smile still wide on his lips. I was completely unnerved by this. I started walking again, but kept my eyes on the man, and he didn't move. Once I had put about half a block between us, I turned away from him for a moment to watch the sidewalk in front of me. The street and sidewalk ahead of me were completely empty. Still nervous, I looked back to where he had been standing to find that he was gone. For the briefest of moments, I actually felt relieved, until I noticed him. He had crossed the street and was now slightly crouched down. I couldn't tell for sure due to the distance and the shadows, but I was sure he was facing me. I had looked away from him for no more than 10 seconds, so it was clear that he had moved pretty fast. I was so shocked that I stood there for some time, staring at him, and then he started moving towards me again. He took giant, exaggerated tiptoe steps, almost like he was a cartoon character sneaking up on someone, except that he was moving very, very quickly. I want to say that at this point I ran away, or I pulled out my spray or my cell phone or anything at all, but I didn't. I just stood there, completely frozen as the smiling man crept towards me, and then he stopped again, about a car length away from me, still smiling, still looking to the sky. When I finally found my voice, I said the first thing that came to my mind. "What the fuck do you want?" In an angry, commanding tone. What came out was a whimper. Whether humans can smell fear, they can most definitely hear it. I heard it in my own voice, and that only made me more afraid. But he didn't react. He just stood there, smiling. And then, after what felt like forever, he turned around, very slowly, and started dance walking away. Just like that. Not wanting to turn my back to him again, I just saw him go, until he was far enough away to almost be out of sight. And then I realized something. He wasn't moving away anymore, nor was he dancing. I was watching as the distant shape of him grew larger and larger. He was coming back my way, and this time he was running. I ran too. I ran until I was off on the side road and back onto a better lit road with traffic. Looking behind me then, he was nowhere to be found. The rest of my way home, I kept glancing over my shoulder, always expecting to see his stupid smile, but he was never there. I lived in that city for 6 months after that night, and I never went out for another walk again. There was something about his face that always haunted me. He didn't look drunk. He didn't look high. He just looked very completely insane. And that is a very, very scary thing to see. I'm not afraid of a ghost, devils, or monsters. It's people that scared me. So one night my boyfriend and I were fighting. I got tired of the fighting, and I chose to leave. I knew my brother would be picking up my son from work, but it would be at 1 in the morning. I sat there thinking just waiting till daylight, but my boyfriend just kept on and on. It didn't make matters better that I kept rolling my eyes and putting my hands up in the air mimicking a talking mouth. Yeah, I know I probably wasn't helping, But I finally had enough, and the place where my son worked was about 3 miles away from my boyfriend's house. So in the middle of him saying stuff to me, I just got up and walked out. I could hear him locking the door behind me. It wasn't the first time he had locked me out. I just shrugged my shoulders and said, "Later, asshole." It was about 10:30 when I left. I was thinking what the best way would be, so off I went. I guess half of the way there was lit by street lights, so I wasn't too concerned. When I got down to the highway that led to my son's work, I didn't know if I should take the highway or the other way that went by a very old house. A house that I heard was haunted since I was a kid. Oh, and there was also some kind of animal thing that roamed around that area. My cousins called it the monkey bear, 'cause that's what it looked like to us when we saw it. So I took the off-ramp and looked around. I was scared, I'll admit it. Well, the other light came from the moon, which wasn't very bright anyway. And no one was out and about, so I had no fear of being kidnapped. I started telling myself how stupid I was to leave, that I didn't want to be fighting all night. So here I'm walking and trying really hard to think good positive thoughts, not the ones that you think of that scare you. So then I decide that I'm gonna sing. So I start singing and I put my hands in my pockets 'cause it's a little chilly outside. Again, kicking myself for being out this late at night. I would get onto my kids for doing it, but hey, do as I say, not as I do. I'm walking and I almost trip myself on the rocks as I start laughing 'cause only I could do that. I trip on air and up the stairs. I know, that's how I am. I'm kind of like listening to the night sounds, so I hear chirping. Not sure if it's crickets or frogs, but then I hear what sounds like someone stepping on the very rocks that I had just almost tripped on. I take a deep breath and think to myself, fuck no, I didn't hear that, and I say to myself, stop trying to scare yourself. I didn't say it very loud, but then I heard it again. I'm off the off-ramp at this point, and on the 4-lane highway. A car is coming, and I think I'm gonna look behind me as it gets closer. Well, it passes and I don't see anything. So as I'm walking, I'm thinking, damn, you're just trying to scare yourself. I shake my head and roll my eyes. I decided to walk a little faster. However, I'm not gonna run. I remember being told not to run if you hear something following you. But damn, if I walk, it might get me anyway. So I decided to use my phone's light. And lucky for me, my phone was basically dying. So I'm walking and I can still hear something behind me. And I stop real fast and turn around. I'm not sure what I was thinking. 'Cause one, if it's a person, what am I gonna do? And two, if it's a monster, what am I gonna do? But there's nothing there. But I know I heard someone there. I know I did. I started thinking to myself again that I'm just being paranoid. I laughed out loud and turned around and said to myself, "You've seen this in a movie before. The brown one dies first." I turn around and by this point I'm getting close to the bridge and the grass is taller. At this point I don't care. I start running. And as I start running, I swear to God, I can hear something running in the grass. But then I make it past the bridge and I see another car coming. I don't care at this point. I'm gonna run or try to run the rest of the way. My fat ass better move. So as the car passes me, I'm thinking that they're most likely laughing at me. But as they pass, they slam on the brakes and come back in reverse. I'm thinking, oh hell no. There's no way I'm going inside a car with someone I don't know. They pull up beside me. I'm out of breath and my side is hurting as I'm having to bend over because I'm sucking air. The window comes down and the native guy says, "It's a little late to be out here, ain't it?" I then say that I'm going to the hospital because I'm going to meet my ride there. Mind you, I don't know the guy, nor the girl that was driving, or even the scared looking guy in the back. Wait a minute. He looks like he's seen a ghost. And then I look at the girl driving and her eyes are big. I'm like, oh shit, I'm in trouble. The guy then opens the door and says, "We can give you a ride the rest of the way. Get in." I then said no thanks. It's right around the bend. And that's when the guy in the back seat says, "Get in. Now." It wasn't mean, but the way he said it kind of scared me. And I was like, sure, fine. I get in the car and she literally burns rubber I'm like, dang girl, slow down. As I'm riding in the car, I feel uneasy about the situation. I know my heart is pounding and my pulse is probably skyrocketing. I try to act like I'm not scared at all, hoping that the brave face that I got going on is working. I'm looking around, and I do like to fidget with things. The guy in the back seat is just looking out the window, and looking out the back window. I'm thinking that this ride is taking forever, and I'm sure this dude is tweaking. Fuck, I should have just stayed put. But then, the guy in the front seat takes out a cigarette. He and the girl driving keep looking at each other, and this is making me feel uneasy. He lights the cigarette and starts talking to himself. He then blows the smoke in the girl's driving face. He continues on and then he blows smoke in our direction. Then he blows out smoke and covers himself in it. I understand what he just did, but I'm not sure why. He then pinches off the end and starts emptying the cigarette while praying. I'm not liking the scenario now. We then pull off into the off-ramp and I see the hospital. As you can imagine the relief that I'm feeling. We pull in and I tell her just drop me off at the entrance. She nods and looks at me with this look like she's scared. I don't know what the fuck that was on the side of the road, but it was following you. I could literally feel my heart drop into my stomach. She turned her face away from me and shook her head. The guy in the back seat starts to nod as well. The guy that rolled down the window looks at her and then looks at me and says, I never seen anything like that. And all I can say is if we didn't give you a ride, whatever that thing was, it would have gotten you. I could see it watching us when we tried to get you in the car. I thought I was going to have to grab you and take off. I look at the guy in the back seat and he won't even look at me now. I look at the guy in the front seat and he has his head down, but then he looks at me and says, I said a prayer for us back there because what I saw scared me, and I don't scare easily. I'm trying to hold back tears, but one of them comes down. I knew I heard someone or something, and it wasn't just my imagination, as now I'm even more scared than when I was walking. He then shakes his head and says, whatever the hell was that stepped out onto the road as we left, I hit my girlfriend on the leg, and that's why she looked at me all scared. She shook her head in agreement. I can tell you this though, in the pitch black of night you could still see it. It seemed blacker than the night, but white or gray light. It didn't look like a person, but it did. That thing was standing, but the way it stood there just didn't seem natural. If you don't have a ride, just say so, 'cause I don't want you walking again. If you were my sister, I would want someone to look out for you. I promised him my brother was coming, and I told him my son gets off at 1. He then said that he also prayed for us, 'cause he doesn't want whatever that was to follow any of us home. I then asked, what else did you see? And he said, I'm gonna tell you once, and never talk about it again. I know my eyes got big 'cause I'm now truly scared. That thing had silver shining eyes. Nothing that I know of has eyes like that. But anyway, it went from standing to 4 legs. When we were talking and I was trying to get you in the car, it was looking at us. And when I saw it, I swear, for a split second, it smiled at me, and I can't get that out of my head. I look back at the guy in the back seat, and he's still not looking at me. He then looks at me and says, the Creator was looking out for you. He put both of us together to meet this night. We're on our way to Broken Bow. We were gonna leave in the morning, but we decided to go ahead and pack up and go tonight. I can say that more and more. I'm just now completely shocked. I then thank the 3 of them for picking me up, and they just leave. I look around 'cause I just feel so uneasy still. I sat down on the bench and I just started crying. The security pulled up and I wiped my eyes, but the tears kept coming. I'm thinking to myself, man, stop being a crybaby. I then look at my phone and I have 10 minutes till my son gets off. But my brother pulls in and I go to his car and get in the back seat. He looks at me and says, y'all fighting again, and he hands me his blunt. Take a hit off that. calm yourself down. I then get home and I go to my room and I'm like scared because we still live out in the sticks. My feet are hurting as I take off my shoes. My dog Bear comes running in. He stays real close to me, even going into the bathroom with me. I guess he can feel that I'm going through it. So we go to the living room and everyone is still up. I go to the kitchen to get me some soda, and that's when I hear it. This low guttural growl. And I feel like I can't move, or maybe I'm just too scared to turn around. The guys are being loud as they're playing Xbox. I then look at my front door. It's my dog making that growling noise. I never heard that from him before. He's sniffing and growling and pawing at the door. I'm scared as fuck again, and I'm just frozen. My brother is up now and looks at the dog and says, "Hey, cut that shit out." I look at him and he says, "At least it's out there and not in here. If it gets in here, then we worry." Bear is still doing that growling noise. I'm like, fuck this. Stop being a scary cat. I open the door and Bear hits the screen door and he runs out barking like he's about to get somebody. I'm scared all over again because I don't want my dog to die. He's a pit bull, but I'm not sure what he's after. I feel stupid because I let him go, and whatever happens will be my fault. I swear off in the distance in the road, there's something standing there. However, at this point I think I'm only trying to scare myself now. I look around for Bear, and I don't hear him, so I call out for him, and he scares the shit out of me when he comes running up the stairs. For that brief moment, I took my eyes off the road. I look back and I shit you not, whatever it is, it's in my driveway. Now, we have a long driveway, and I look at the door to see how far I am away from it. I look back at my driveway, and there's something black, grayish looking still standing there. Bear then starts growling and barking, and I grab his collar, and with all the strength that I had, I muster a sound like I'm not the least bit afraid, and I yell, "Get off my property right now. You're not welcome here." Bear is also trying the best that he can to get loose from me. I open the door and put him in. I go inside and I light my sage and cedar and I start praying. And that's about it. The reason I didn't go into detail about it is because every time that I talk about this situation or about this thing, it's because something weird always happens. When I told my boyfriend, he just rolled his eyes and said, "Oh wow," but I kid you not, later that day, the lights started to flicker. When I told my best friend, her TV paused and it wouldn't work. We weren't even watching a movie or anything. We were simply watching The View as we ended up turning it off. I know this isn't scary, but I did tell a friend about it, and this was right at night. And after I did tell him, his dog started barking and growling. My dogs last night, as I was sharing my story with you, were pacing and kept doing this strange kind of bark. I then said out loud, "You're not welcome here." My daughter pulled her headphones off and said, I simply just shook my head. I lit my sage and prayed again. I haven't had any weird shit happen, except for like last night. So I'm actually writing this during the daytime. Some things are better not to be talked about. Stay safe, everyone. I really began getting into hunting a few years ago. I started out hunting with my uncle on his property. From the first Thanksgiving week that we went out, I was hooked. Watching my uncle walk ahead of me, creeping as quietly as can be, me following behind, scanning the trees and bushes on all sides, each of us with our shotguns ready to swing them up like a rubber band at the first sign of movement. It was quite an experience, especially after a long week of seeing almost nothing. I ended up shooting my first deer, a medium-sized doe. The whole series of post-hunting, gutting, skinning, breaking down the deer, and finally eating something that you hunt to yourself. But anyways, this story isn't really about my opinion or mindset on hunting. Rather, it's about what made me swear that I'll never go hunting again. After about 4 years of our ritual Thanksgiving deer hunts, I had to move away from my family to Upper Michigan. For those of you who don't know, Upper Michigan is a densely wooded area with lots of lakes. There aren't that many people living up there. The place I had to move to was right out near Cooper County. The summers were kind of humid, and the winter was terrible to deal with. I've never been to Alaska before, but it's the closest comparison I can come up with, given that I was kind of living on a peninsula. If you live in Florida, you should know about the extremes of weather that can come from living on a peninsula. Anyways, from the time that I first took the 20-hour drive moving up there, I noticed that once you pass Lower Michigan, across the bridge into Upper Michigan, there's nothing but trees and lots of semis traveling through the forest roads. It actually gave me a really creepy vibe that first time that I went up there. Like, what the hell am I moving to? But needless to say, hunting and fishing culture are already huge up there, so I was excited about that aspect. I've never gone hunting by myself before, as it had only been a holiday activity, as it had only been a holiday thing to do with my family. My first year living up there, all of that would change. It turned out that because of Thanksgiving, I wouldn't be able to make the 20-hour drive one way due to my responsibilities at work. I was really bummed about not being able to spend Thanksgiving with my family, but I was gonna be damned if I would let this mess up my yearly deer hunting ritual. So when the day before Thanksgiving rolls around, I put on my uniform, grab my gun, and an old brownish colored tarp that I had that would make for a makeshift hunting blind once propped up with sticks. I also packed my tent in the car, in case I decided to just camp out and get my hunting on early Thanksgiving morning. I also brought some water, some venison jerky from the previous year, and a 15-pack of my favorite beer just in case I was feeling extra thirsty. Anyways, I had asked some local hunters where are some good spots on public land, and I drove out to one of those areas I had randomly chosen from the ones I was told about, since I'd never been to any of them before. The drive was full of hills and valleys, where the incredibly dense tree line, consisting mostly of pine, hugged the road. I'll be honest with you, I was a bit nervous. The lack of civilization on this road was getting me even more creeped out. It was early morning at this time, so a dense fog still hung in the trees. I was drinking my coffee, and I kept the radio off, mentally getting ready. But being the first time I was hunting alone, I was really focused on basic gun safety, survival techniques, and the common sense practices of hunting, such as when to use a call, drips of dull urine on my boots, as well as spraying myself down with canned dirt smell, and never forgetting my hunter's orange vest, and also a hat for when I was walking around outside the blind. I also had the antlers from last year's buck, which I thought I could use to rake against trees to attract some buck in the rut looking for a fight, a technique that I had seen on YouTube, but never really tried myself yet. I finally pulled up to some kind of makeshift rest stop area that I had been told about, a flat area of dirt where cars could pull off to one side, where you could enter the woods without having to park too close to the road. I shouldered my pack as well as my tent, and clipped on a fanny pack containing my large bag of jerky, and some other items such as a gutting knife, gloves, bandages, and so forth. I locked my car and began walking slowly through the woods, one slow step at a time, in order to avoid making too much sound by crunching sticks. My eyes scanned the surrounding trees as the fog began to lift, and the early morning sun began to rise. The woods were completely quiet at this time. As I progressed, I kept my eyes peeled for piles of leaves, or areas of dirt that had been rotted around him by some buck, as well as for scrapings on trees from the antlers. The first sign that caught my attention, however, was a pile of scat. It was warm to the touch, and as I kept moving, I found the ground turning from hard dirt into moss. There were a few other areas of scat that I also found, and also would appear to be a trail that looked like it might have been a deer highway, since the leaves were very flat and disturbed in this area. I decided to move about 50 yards away from this area in case it were a spot where the deer had been bedding down. I would be able to get them as they were either coming or going. I found a nice flat area where I had a good line of sight to the deer trail, and and started clearing the ground of leaves and sticks. I found several larger sticks and began setting up my tarp to make the blind. I was going to be in a kneeling or laying position as I watched for the deer, and it just so happens to be the most steady position for aiming with my gun. I set my pack down and took out a few items such as my jerky and began to chew on it while I waited, as well as my claws and a salt brick that I had brought with me just in case things turned desperate. I could at least hope that by putting the salt lick out, I would attract something overnight. The hours stretched long as I lay in the now completely silent forest, just staring out from one side and then another of the blind, thinking that every twig blowing in the wind might be a deer, and instead just being disappointed. There was nothing weird about this. I knew that hunting was often a waiting game, and that's what I had signed up for. As twilight came upon me, I had a last second thought that I might go walk around a bit, see if I could stir something up before nightfall. Before I was going to do that, I had to set my tent and get a little fire going so it would all be ready for me by the time that I got back. I also attached my trail cam to a tree facing that deer trail so I could take a look at what way they were going. After setting things up for the night, I grabbed my gun and began walking towards that trail, heading north. The sun was getting low, so I moved kind of quickly, not bothering too much about snapping twigs and moving the leaves around, not thinking I would be able to startle a deer and get the drop on it in a wooded area that I was completely unfamiliar with. I walked for what I thought was about a mile, when I finally crested a hill and was looking down into a thick wooded valley. I scanned the trees. I spied a small hunting cabin sitting there in the thick of it, somehow camouflaged well despite the smokestack billowing clouds of black smoke at the moment. I quickly grabbed my hat and looked at it, just double checking that I was wearing my orange, and I began to go down the hill towards the cabin, presuming that there were some other local hunters down there. I figured I would just see if they had any tips, or if they had already gotten something earlier. I was now entering what I presumed was private property, but due to the lack of posted signs, I wasn't too worried. It also seemed like someone had simply built this on the public land, not caring due to the fact that it was so remote and isolated from the main town areas. As I got close to the cabin, I realized that it was actually bigger than I had thought, and it didn't have windows on all sides like you might expect from a hunting cabin. As I went around front, I noticed that the leaves and brush had also been kept well clear from the structure. There was a makeshift roof front porch and was completely unlevel from rocks. I shouldered my gun and went up to the door, knocking a few times soft, and then a few times a bit hard. I didn't hear anything from inside, so I went around the side of the cabin and chanced to look into one of the windows, hoping that I wouldn't piss someone off who wanted nothing to do with me. I could still see the wood stove from the window, and it was cracked open, and it was glowing red inside. It was getting a bit chilly, and my heart melted at the thought of sitting next to such a stove all night. There was a rocking chair in front of the fire, and also an old wooden table in the corner with a bench near it, which was all I could make out through this window. I could tell there was another room to the cabin, most likely a bedroom in the back. I went back to the front door and called out pretty loud, "Hey, anyone home?" There was no answer. I shrugged my shoulders and began walking back up towards the hill when suddenly, without warning, snow began to fly all over at once. A cold front had definitely just come in, and I was actually starting to shiver. As I climbed the hill, the snow grew thicker. It almost looked like I was in for a blizzard. I started to get a really bad feeling since I had been checking the weather the whole week, and nothing of this sort had been predicted for the area. This meant that I had no idea just what to expect of the weather at this point. Whether this was just a squall, or if I was going to end up buried if I tried to sit in that tent tonight. It was now growing extremely dark. By the time that I crested the hill, I could see nothing, not even my own hand in front of me. That's when I stopped. I was having serious doubts I could find my way back to the camp in this kind of weather. Imagine getting completely lost and turned around in this blizzard with no shelter and no fire. For a moment, I considered the different options that I had. So the choice that I made is something that I'll continue to think about for the rest of my life. I chose to go back down to that cabin that I had found. Maybe the owner had returned by now. or maybe he got enough deer and left for the night. Either way, it was my only chance for shelter. I ended up groping my way tree by tree back to the cabin. I could make out that the chimney was still smoking, and I knocked again very loud, calling out, "Hello? Anyone home?" Again, I heard nothing in the now eerie silence of the forest. I turned the door handle and pushed the door open, immediately stepping into the small, warm room. By now, it was very chilly, so I quickly walked in, pulling the door shut behind me before calling out again to see if anyone was home. I noticed that indeed, there was another door leading to a back room, but it was closed. My boots were covered with snow, so I removed them and set them next to the wood stove. I then took off my jacket and coveralls, setting them on the back of the rocking chair to dry. The heat coming from the stove felt like heaven. I had another chance to look around the cabin. Even though the light was very dim, I spotted no flashlights, candles, or any source of light beyond the stove's glow. I noticed there was a pile of firewood in one corner, so I figured I would be able to keep the fire going all night. I quickly sat down in the rocking chair and began warming myself up. The coziness of the fire, in contrast to the cold wind outside, made me think of home. I felt terribly alone. I missed my family so much, and I was really beating myself up about a lot of things. What was I doing stuck out here by myself on Thanksgiving? Why didn't I come out here with a friend to at least share some of this? Well, some of this misery, that is. As I continued with those self-depressing thoughts, I noticed something sitting on the table. I stood up and went over to it. It was an old-fashioned growler with what looked like beer inside. I thought about the beers I had left back at the campsite, and how nice it would be to drink a few down while sitting by the fire. How it would shield me from this cloud of darkness that was now hanging over me. I did have my wallet with me, and I figured I could pay back whoever owned this cabin, with interest, for the trouble. I was very thirsty. I slipped a $20 bill on the table so that I wouldn't forget. I got the growler and sat back down in the rocking chair. I opened the top of it, smelled it. It wasn't beer in there, but a dark red wine. Oh well, I thought. I tipped the jug back and took a deep gulp of the dry, yet fruity red wine. I wasn't accustomed to drinking wine. In that moment, the burning in my belly felt like heaven. I then felt a lightness come over my head. After a few more drinks, before I knew it, I was floating into darkness, that is. When I woke up, I was now in a laying position, even though I had fallen asleep, in the rocking chair, that is. Sitting up, I quickly grabbed my chest and felt my torso, making sure that everything was okay, and that I hadn't been shot or something like that when I had dozed off. It was really warm before, but now it was cold, very cold. I looked around. It was dark. I could tell I was still in the same cabin. By this point, my eyes adjusted to the darkness, and from what I could tell, I was lying on the bench next to the table, and I quickly confirmed this by grabbing the table and pulling myself up into the sitting position. As I sat up, I accidentally kicked something with my foot, knocking it over. It was my boots. I then realized that I was laying on top of my hunting suit, as if it were a mattress. I sighed, realizing I must have gotten drunker than I thought, and somehow blacked out. I must have neglected the fire and made a little makeshift bed for myself on this bench. The rosy glow that was in the wood stove was now completely gone. I stood up slowly in the darkness and started putting my coveralls and boots in an effort to ward off the cold. I then walked slowly across the room through the darkness to the corner where I had spied that wood pile. I did feel around for some sticks to use as tinder, and grabbed a few larger pieces of firewood as well. As I returned to the stove, I realized I had nothing to light the fire with. I shoved the tinder in there first, hoping there was enough hot coals to light them. However, I couldn't even smell smoke coming out of it. A few minutes later, I felt the stove with my hand, and it was completely cold. I thought to myself about how the fire had died so completely when it had been glowing just a few hours ago. I couldn't remember whether I shut the door in the event of it possibly suffocating the fire, As I stood there thinking, there was a light that suddenly exploded in front of my eyes. I looked towards it, and I could tell it was a lit match. I now stood face to face with a man. He was kinda old. As I gazed into the thousands of tiny wrinkles covering his face, I saw that the eyes were not there. He didn't have eyes. That's when I screamed at the top of my lungs, but tripped on the firewood piled at my feet, smacking my head off on some part of the stove. I looked up and saw that the man was still standing there. He wasn't moving. I was on my feet in a second, adrenaline coursing through me, and I flew out the fucking door, my hunting jacket swinging in my hands. I stumbled across the porch and dove into the snow. When I looked down, I could tell there was a big pool of blood. Where I landed, I ran. Where I was running, I had no idea, but my legs were pumping. As I continued to run, the wind picked up, and I could have sworn I heard someone yelling something, but I could barely understand it over the wind. But it seemed to be the old man, repeating the same word over and over at the top of his lungs. It sounded like peacock. That's when I ran faster. I must have tripped a few times as I came across hills or small drop-offs that would send me flying halfway down a slope, even once into a frozen creek. I was soaked from head to foot by now and covered in snow and mud, but I kept going anyway, despite the fact that I could no longer feel my feet at this point. When I finally calmed down and my pace had slowed, everything began to dawn on me. I had no idea what hour of the night it was, or how far, or in what way I was going. It could soon be dawn, or it could have been midnight for all I knew. I continued going as I started feeling cold, and the adrenaline was starting to wear off. I was actually starting to feel pretty strange, and began wondering whether there was something in that wine. From what I could see in the darkness, the forest now seemed completely different. The trees and their limbs started to look weird, almost like they were reaching out to me. After what seemed to be a couple more hours, I really began to think that I was just going around in circles, until I finally fell. Then, I spotted my only chance of salvation, a small opening in the side of a cliff, what looked like a bear cave. I took a deep breath, and I wish I could say there was even a moment's hesitation about how sketchy the situation was, especially inside this cave. But there wasn't. The cold now felt like it was tearing my skin off. I lowered myself into the cave, foot first, and actually had to claw my body into it. The opening was so tight. After I passed through an entrance that was most likely 3 times as long as my height, the cave actually opened up into a larger cavern where I could even stand up. Even though I was slightly bent at the waist, I quickly felt warm, with no way of seeing my surroundings. It was the kind of darkness your eyes can never adjust to. I took a few more steps, just touching the wall and sealing with my gloved hand, so that I wouldn't trip or hit my head on anything. However, I could go no further. Even though I knew I could get warmer a bit further from the entrance, I was terrified that there might be some animal, or some sort of giant spider. Then, it suddenly dawned on me that there was some unusual weight in my right coat pocket. My hand immediately moved there, and I felt a small box. What the hell? I knew it was nothing I had put there. As I pulled it out, I felt a rough strip on one side of the box. I slid it open, realizing it was a box of matches. It must have been that crazy old man, but why? That's when I heard a strange noise that sounded like something moving from further into the cave. I quickly grabbed a match from the box and struck it. Once, then again, and the whole cave burst into a low light. As I looked around me, I saw a slight bend in the cavern in front of me, but nothing else. It was completely empty. A draft then picked up. I then heard the noise again, but more clearly this time. It was definitely some strange sounding footfalls joined by some kind of slithering sound. I wonder if there was some kind of snake disturbing some rocks or something, but I was hoping it wasn't. I fumbled with the matches again and was able to light one. The sound stopped as the cavern was again illuminated. I stood, listening, but I couldn't hear anything. It was quiet. Absolute silence. A second draft picked up, and again my match went out. Then I heard the same sound, but what sounded like either footfalls or falling rocks. The sound was happening very quickly now, and the slithering or dragging sound sounded like it was in the same area with me. My fingers fumbled, breaking one match, and then another, and then the cavern exploded with light again. In front of me, I saw a creature dragging itself towards me with its arms. It looked human, except the legs were not there. The old man's words, the peacock, flickered into my mind as I stared at the holes in its body. Dark holes covered every inch of it. They were eye sockets, many of which were filled with hundreds of eyes that now stared at me. It now started to slither towards me. The eyes blinked and stared at me as it let out a hissing sound. It seemed to be in pain from the light of the match. As it came within reach, I screamed and threw the match at it. I reached for my hunting knife. I tripped and fell over. I struggled, but I could feel it overpowering me. I felt its fingers searching for my eyes, pressing and gouging hard. I couldn't get to my knife, but I grabbed 5 or 6 matches at a time and struck them together, creating some huge flame. The creature then shrunk away from me, but it blocked the entrance. It shrieked very horribly, its hundreds of eyes blinking at me. I then started running deeper into the cave, in the same direction it had come from, and I haven't stopped running. I thought long ago I would have come to a dead end, and I was going to have to face it again, but I haven't. Whenever I stop for too long, I can hear it slithering from behind me. I'm not sure how deep I've gone now. I'm not sure how long I've been running for, but it seems like it's a maze of caves down here. If I make it out of this, I will never come back to Michigan. Shit, I'll never go hunting again. Don't come up here. And don't go into any cabin or any cave in Michigan. Stay away from here. I thought long ago I would have come to a dead end and was gonna have to face this creature again, but I haven't. But I've been running out of matches, and there's only a few left. My phone's almost dead, and I'm recording all of this on my phone. I do have my knife, and I'm ready to use it. But if anyone finds this, just know, if I'm somehow being punished for all of this, for taking the life of an innocent creature, if the hunter has now truly become the hunted, I will never go hunting again. I swear, God above me, I swear, please. If you find this, just tell my family one thing. Tell them. This is one of the scariest experiences that has ever happened to me. Even simply by writing this, it brings back so many nightmares. And it reminds me as to why I will never go camping again. I had been attending Camp Rock Water for about 4 years now. I used to love camping, being able to see some new faces, getting to do fun and exciting activities. My favorite was the river rope swing. I never wanted to leave that swing once I got on. I was just so excited to go back, mainly because it would be my last year I went. And then summer finally came, and it was finally time to go camping. When I got to camp after a 4-hour car ride, I was so excited. I was remembering all my old favorite places. First things first, my mom had to take me to the lodge to get signed up. When we got into the lodge, there were a lot of people there. We waited in line until it was our turn to sign up. Before we were handed any papers, the lady at the table told us that there had recently been some weird things going on a few miles down through the woods from us. I just brushed it off and ignored it. I think I was just too excited to finally be able to go to camp again. My mom helped me lug my suitcase to the cabin. When we got there, I was so happy to see some old friends from last year. Kyle was one of my longtime camp friends. He was sitting in the corner making his bed. Jacob, another one of my really good friends, was on the floor taking stuff out of his bag. And who could forget about Brad? He was putting stuff in the closet, like baseball bats and golf clubs. As for the other two kids, I had no idea who they were, but they both seemed to like me. It turns out they were brothers. Their names were Brandon and Nathan, and it being their first year here, they were kind of nervous. We all got settled in, and after our parents left, we sat down and started talking about past adventures in camp. It wasn't for another hour that our cabin leader arrived. When he got in, he kind of looked at us all with a gloomy face. He turned to us and said, "Hey guys, I'm your cabin leader for the next 2 weeks. Now, before we do anything, I have to tell you that some things have changed, and we will have to be more cautious due to the weird things that have been happening." We all were a little uneasy, but we wouldn't let that stop us from having the best summer ever. The day continued on as normal. We introduced ourselves, played some cards in our cabin, went outside and played basketball, went to the mess hall to eat, and came back to the cabin to sleep. It was kind of strange that there were only 6 cabins full of people, when there's always around 30. So the next day we woke up. It was raining hard. The sounds of the rain smacking the metal roofs of the cabins echo off to the distance. The camp leader was nowhere to be found. So we kind of sat around the middle of the cabin, just waiting for our cabin leader to get back. We then started talking about some ghost stories that happened around the camp. Some of them seemed completely stupid, but others were kind of scary. And just to let you all know, outside of our cabin, there were about 400 acres of woods. In those woods, there were some obstacle courses, the chapel, and the river. There was one more thing in the woods that nobody really knew about, because it was so far off. It was the original Camp Rock water cabins. There were only a few of the older cabin leaders that knew about it and how to get to them. They say that back in the early 1900s, when the camp was first established, 2 kids got into a fight in their cabins, and one kid killed the other in his sleep. He had apparently taken a heavy rock and dropped it on the other boy's head. Legend has it that the presence of the boy who was killed is seen walking around the old campground and chapel. They say that the boy can sometimes be seen crying at the back of the chapel. Someone even said they went to the cabins and saw his head peeking out from one of the windows. At this point, everyone in our cabin was really scared. I swear, Brad was gonna have a panic attack. That's when our camp leader came rushing in through our cabin door. He told us that we needed to pack our things and go to the lodge. We would have to call our parents in the morning to tell them to take us home. We walked all the way from our cabin to the lodge in the rain, completely wet. When we got there, only 4 other cabins had been there. As I was sitting next to the fireplace with my cabin mates, we overheard people talking about what was going on. Someone had said that all of cabin 6 had gone missing after returning from the chapel. The conversations after that got really boring, that we ended up falling asleep in the lodge. Later that night, I woke all of my friends. I wanted to go and check out what happened in the woods. Call me stupid all you want, but mind you, I was also younger. Though at first all of my friends didn't want to go, they still agreed to tag along with me. We grabbed a few flashlights and snuck past the cabin leaders that were sleeping near the exit. When we got outside, it was still raining, but now it was also pitch black outside. This still didn't stop us from heading over to the woods. When our group finally got to the mouth of the woods, Brad and Jake just couldn't do it. They walked back to the lodge through the shortcut in the gardens. All that were left were Kyle, Brandon, Nathan, and I. We walked slowly through the path that leads to the chapel. Every now and then, we would trip over some uprooted trees, but we still kept going. We could see the chapel ahead of us, but we knew there was something wrong. It was very quiet. The rain had stopped too, and there was no wind. nor any kind of animal in sight. As we walked up to the chapel, Brandon, who was carrying one of the flashlights, just started screaming. He then ran as fast as he could back towards camp and dropped his flashlight. The light was shining through the chapel, and I kid you not, through one of the windows, we saw the face of a child crying. That's when we all screamed and started to run towards the camp as well. Out of fear, we lost all sense of direction and had no idea where any of us were. As we came up to the ravine that led down to the river, that's where we saw in the pitch darkness a silhouette of a small black figure that was blocking our way. Our only way out was taking the ravine. Nathan, Kyle, and I began going down the side of the ravine, and we noticed another figure. That's when I shot my flashlight down a ways, and there was Brandon, just lying dead, with his head smashed in, blood everywhere. To be honest though, it seemed like he had tripped maybe on an uprooted tree and fell down the side of the ravine, but we had to just keep running, so we left him there. We were halfway down the ravine when we could feel the sweat falling into our eyes like ocean water, and there it was again, the figure of a little boy standing at the end of the ravine, waiting for us to play with him. I told everyone just to keep running, and that's when I looked behind us, and Nathan had disappeared. He was no longer with us. I'm not sure if he took another way or ended up running a different path or back, but he was completely gone. Kyle and I kept running, and that's when I saw the old stairs coming up to our left that led back up to the back part of camp. When we got to the stairs and we were almost to the top, that's when we could hear a kid saying, "We can play with the rocks." We didn't even stop to look back. We ran all the way to the lodge. When we got there, all of the cabin leaders had been away. 2 other cabins had left to go investigate what was going on in those woods. They both went missing. And then Kyle finally spoke up. Even though he hadn't said anything all night, he did say, "I saw him. The boy just wanted to play with us." And that was it. The next morning, our parents picked all of us up, and we never went back again. Years have passed since that encounter. Kyle was booked into a mental hospital. They said for some serious mental issues that he had going on. Jake and Brad were never found, and nobody ever mentioned anything about them after that day. As for the other 3 cabins of kids, nobody ever found out what happened or where they went. Maybe nobody cares. But I will tell you this though, after this experience, I have never, nor will I ever, go camping again. My grandfather told me a story once, as we sat around a campfire in his backyard in the cool night of the Arizona desert. The horizon was clear, and each star twinkled in a purple sky, with a full fat moon hanging low over the mountains. His voice was raspy, the result of a lifetime of smoking cigars and drinking whiskey. The fire danced and shined across his wide dark eyes as he settled into his seat, ready to tell his story. Way back when I was a boy, about your age, I lived outside a reservation with your great-grandfather. He had returned from the war and set about raising horses and cattle on a 100-acre ranch settled between a brambly mountainside with good dirt for growing thorn brush and not much else. One night, my mother was sick, and Pa and I took a trip into town, about 50 miles away. straight through a dry desert, over a washed-out creek, and some old abandoned farmsteads. Pa and I were driving in an old Ford pickup truck. I remember it was dark out, inky, and thick, with only the lights of our old truck lighting up the road. I remember it so much. The engine began to sputter, and the truck slowed to a jerky stop. "Damn it," Pa said, guiding the Ford to the side of the road. As it coasted to a stop, my pa said, "Stay here, son," and he stepped out into the darkness, shutting the door with a heavy thud. My window was down, and the cool desert air was breezy and felt good on my hot face and neck. Pa was getting water from the back to cool down the engine, and that's when I smelled it. Rotten eggs. Strange, I thought, to smell sulfur in the desert. My nose also picked up the smell of one of those dead bloated cattle that would drop from the heat and lay there until the crows pecked enough holes in their hide to cause the whole thing to explode. It stunk, and I gagged. My skin started to tingle too. The back of my neck felt itchy, and my face started to get very hot. The wind stopped blowing, with the stink filling the cab. "Pa," I called out. No answer. My heart started beating, and I felt such a fear in me, in my bones, in my chest. I tell you, I never felt fear like this. Not until Vietnam. Not until I saw men dying around me. I locked the door and reached over for my pa's door and saw a shadow bound across the road through both dim beams of light across the partly open hood. Grandfather paused telling the story. He spit a fat piece of tobacco to his side, and he looked very pensive into the darkness. I realized I was holding my breath and gasped for air. The night was breezy, but I was sweating and clammy. "What about your father? What did you see?" My grandfather, continuing the story, sighed. "A creature." He shook his head. "You have to understand, there were legends. Old legends. Much older than what's out there in the valley. Older still than Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, than the old chiefs and their shamans, the Apache and Hopi and Cherokee, and all them old tribes and First Peoples. They told tales. They told stories about dark magic. Something about a deal made with the old spirits of blood sacrifice to gain power, old power, enough to fight each other and the Spaniards, and later the white man that came for their land and women. They called them." He paused. Grandfather took a deep breath and looked towards the fire, to the sky, the desert, the creek, the moon, the sun, and then leaned a little bit and said, "They would call them skinwalkers, old warriors, resurrected as skinless men, walking on deer legs, with the torso of a man and the head of a coyote, but they were messed up, long and disfigured, teeth like a Bowie knife, long arms, and standing 7 feet tall, even hunched over. They would gut the old cowboys and white riders. They'll run through the bullets, part the Spanish armor like it was a potato sack. And boy, could they change their voice to match a person you knew or might know. And that's what I saw, big and fast. Only for a second, it ran across the road, gray and molted, muscle flexing under its legs, clumping on the road, stringy muscle hunched shoulders. And it turned, looked right into the cab, and looked at me, right into my eyes. And I swear, it grinned at me. I sank into my seat. In fear, shaking, I knew my death was coming. I smelled ozone and brimstone. The air felt like right before the lightning comes and blows a tree to smithereens, charged and full with power. I yelled for Pa, but no words came out, just a dry squeak. I started to shake as my grandfather told his story. He was still here, so I knew he lived. But the supernatural always fascinated me, and even now, I felt the force of his words. The real power of skinwalkers was trickery. Sure, they could change their voices, but also their skin. That's why the gods took their hide, so they could take others. Not for long, the legend says, maybe an hour, before the soul of the skin that they were wearing would come looking for their mortal shell before going to whatever hell awaited them. Even though I think that getting skinned alive was hell enough. A minute passed in what felt like a lifetime, 1 second in 1,000 years. My father's door opened, and I jerked my head to the left, putting up my hands to fend off an attack. "Son, it's me," my father said. Before climbing into the cab, he got the steering wheel and pulled himself in an awkward way, jerking himself into the seat. I cringed into the corner. I looked at him. I looked hard. Your great-grandfather was a good man. Treated me and my mom right. He fought the Nazis and saw the worst of man in Poland when he freed all those camps. And now, I was taking his measure. Is this my father? Do I make a run? Or do I die? Is it him or not? Let's go get that medicine for your mom, as he pulled the truck into gear and pulled it out into the road. And our trip resumed. I guess it was him after all. But how did you know? Was it because he said something about your mom? I knew, because out the window, out the corner of my eye, I saw that same beast running 50 miles an hour right next to our car, looking at me with those yellow eyes and grinning mouth. I looked and saw it, hunched and angry, running next to us. My pa kept his eyes on the road, looking straight ahead. "Son," he said, "don't look at it." That's how I knew it was my dad. He knew what to do, and he kept telling me to just keep looking straight ahead and to not look at whatever was around us, running. He then told me that by acknowledging its presence, you give it power. That's where my grandfather finished the story. I kept staring at him, but by this time, he was just looking straight ahead, looking around me, and said we should go inside. As we went inside the house, he then told me to not ever mention skinwalkers. He also said that speaking their name out loud or mentioning them at all, even in text, even in stories, even if someone else is telling you a story, is supposed to make them aware of your existence. I would like to share my experience with you. At first I thought about asking for it to be anonymous, but the truth is that the few people who matter to me and who will recognize this already know about it. I am a real estate agent. Some time ago, when I changed companies, I was lucky to be assigned one of the most important properties we had for sale. Actually, maybe not lucky, as you will judge. We had many expensive homes, but also simple ones. Among these properties was a very well-equipped cabin that used to belong to a famous singer. It even had a small recording studio. It was a small but very high-end cabin, and the path around it had been built very carefully. Despite everything, it seemed to be in the middle of nowhere. You had to search for it very specifically to be able to get there. At times, the road seemed to end, and also any navigation app couldn't lead you to it. It was surrounded only by mountains, and the nearest town was a few hours away by car. It was a real beauty. It was in the Sierra Madre Occidental in Mexico. From what I heard about what people say in the States, this is similar to the Appalachian Trail, a mountain region that runs through different states in Mexico. It had been in the company's portfolio before I even got there. For several years, the owner had been indecisive and asked not to show it, but finally, it coincided with the day that I started, that he finally made up his mind to sell it. It was going to be difficult to sell. The price wasn't low, and it was hard to get to the cabin. It was for a very specific type of person who had sufficient resources and who was extremely protective of their privacy. When I went to go see it for the first time, I had to be joined by another colleague from the firm. There was no way I could have found it on my own. From that exact time, the feeling of being there in the middle of nowhere was overwhelming. It was just the two of us. There's a sense of desolation that I suppose can be stimulating for some type of people. But to me, it was terrifying. And my colleague felt the same way too. He told me he was grateful that it was now my turn to handle that sale. It was going to be a great commission, but he found no joy in having to go there, especially because he emphasized that he had no intention of going back alone. We reviewed what needed to be renovated and left. My colleague insisted we do it before nightfall. There are some parts where it seems the road disappears at night, and it's terrible. Let's finish as soon as we can, he told me. I noted everything that needed fixing and contacted a contractor who told me it could be done in 2 days of work. I wasn't going to travel there 2 days in a row, so I chose to stay in that house, get ahead on some other work, and supervise that all the repairs were done in the best way possible. Staying there alone was the worst thing that I have ever done. That night, I experienced the most scariest event of my life. I traveled there in a caravan with the 2 trucks of the workers and the contractor. Even though I had warned them, they were surprised by how remote the location was. They actually worked very quickly, in a hurry, but I took that as a good thing. It seemed like they wanted to finish everything in one day, but they were running out of time. I warned them what my colleague had told me, that the road gets very complicated at nightfall, so shortly before 7, they started their journey back. I got stuff ready for dinner, and at a certain point, I even began to enjoy that solitude, everything being quiet. I imagined living in a place like that, at least for seasons, writing or doing something similar. Maybe that's why the singer who had built it was attracted to it. I sat at the table on the white wooden porch. That's when I realized there were no insects. I also noticed that there were no sounds of crickets, no animal noises. I tried to remember if I had seen any animals, but not even a squirrel the whole entire journey from the main road to the hour-and-a-half dirt road to get there. It was at that moment when I thought I saw something. At first, I thought I was being paranoid. You know, those situations that makes you see things when they're not really there. Well, that was the case. I thought I saw a woman's face, completely white, among the branches of some trees, as if there was somebody just standing there, just showing their face. I stood up. I took a few steps towards what I saw, and it didn't move, and I rushed back inside the cabin. I locked the door and I looked out the window, and there was nothing there. After a few minutes, I told myself I was just seeing things, so I decided to go back to work in the studio. The silence in the studio was overwhelming. I felt like I could hear my own heartbeat. I dedicated myself to writing on my computer for a while, until I noticed the light starting to flicker. That's when I realized I hadn't checked the gas in the generator, and I had been using it a lot during that workday. I opened the door, and as soon as I did, I thought I heard some laughing in the distance. My first reaction was to think that the workers had returned, but that didn't make sense. By then, they should have been arriving in town. The same sound happened again, catching my attention this time. I went outside to the porch again. It could have been a bird, maybe making a sound that I could have confused with laughing, but there was no other noise, and it was a strange hour for a bird that wasn't nocturnal to be around. I realized it was coming from the same direction where I thought I had seen that face a few hours before. I checked my phone, only to remember that there was no signal in that place at all. A few kilometers away, about 20 minutes, there was signal at times. I remember because I had stopped with a colleague to send a message the first time we went to the place. For a moment, I didn't know what to do. Should I go to town or back home? Was I really going to drive back 4 hours just to return and make it back by morning? I went back into the cabin and started feeling very anxious. My chest started to hurt. I had no idea what was outside, and even though all logic told me it was just an animal, I couldn't contain my nerves. Without thinking any further, I grabbed my keys and ran to my car. I started driving down the path that seemed denser. I drove and drove until the sound of notifications on my phone started to alert me that there was a bit of signal. It was minimal, but it was something. I opened my messaging app and talked with some of the workers. They told me that they confirmed that they had arrived safely and would see me in the morning. I talked a bit with my boss and my girlfriend, and finally, I was able to calm down. It was time to return to the cabin. It was evident to me that my nerves, the solitude, and all the silence had played tricks on me. That's why nobody else wanted to take the task of selling this, despite the juicy commission. It was difficult, but it was my chance to prove that I could do it. I ended up turning the vehicle around. I had barely advanced a few hundred meters back when I realized I had made a mistake at some point. I couldn't see the road ahead. There was nothing but trees. I had to get out, walk back a few steps, and try to figure everything out. If it weren't for the car lights, it would be pitch black out here. I did find a path about 50 meters back at an almost impossible curve. In fact, there were many entrances that seemed like new roads, but they led nowhere. At least at night they seemed like entrances. I figured that most likely from above, this whole area must look like a maze. I imagined it would look amazing if I asked those who would film the cabin to also take some drone shots of the area. I did calm down, but when I arrived back at the cabin, I noticed that the door was open and the lights were off. None of these things were the way that I had left them. I went in to check and saw that everything seemed normal, or so it appeared. I checked everywhere, but there was no one there. Then, I checked the generator, and it was out of gas. It was possible that I simply didn't close the door, and that maybe the air had swung it open. The lights had most likely gone out because the generator had run out of fuel. I began to convince myself that being full of anxiety and being nervous had everything to do with it. I kept telling myself that it was all just my imagination, that I was alone in a cabin in the woods, far from everything. That was all, and I kept repeating it to myself. I was in the back looking for the gas tank for the generator when I heard something else. The sound of footsteps, as if someone was walking inside the cabin. I rubbed my eyes and pinched myself, as they say, to know that I wasn't dreaming and that I wasn't imagining anything. It was real. Someone was walking inside. I walked slowly towards the side. If someone was inside, I didn't want them to see me through the windows. In the distance, at the front, I saw my car just as I had left it, with the door open. I crouched and approached, but I heard the footsteps inside also heading towards the door. I heard them open it, and then I heard someone walking towards the car. From my spot, I couldn't see who it was, but we were less than 3 meters apart. The footsteps descended from the porch to the gravel floor. Not knowing if they would walk towards the side where I was, I dropped to the ground and rolled under the cabin's floor. The space underneath was enough to hide me. I couldn't see, but I could hear the sound of steps going around the cabin onto the gravel path. After some time of listening to them, I focused on making as little noise as possible. I was very tired. It must have lasted about half an hour until I was sure that no one was close. Then, I decided to come out. I approached and closed my car, making sure everything was still there. I went into the house and secured the doors and windows. Everything seemed fine. I did try to stay awake. The plan was to sleep until the workers arrived the next day. They said they were going to arrive here very early, and everything would be fine. I kept repeating to myself that everything was going to be okay. However, around 3 a.m., I was dying of sleep. My eyes were closing. I thought maybe I could sleep in the locked studio and nothing would happen. It had been hours since I heard or saw anything strange. I looked for some water, a blanket, and a pillow, and then that's when I heard a noise. The glass of water fell from my hand. The car alarm had gone off. My instincts kicked in and made me run to the window. And there, illuminated by the flashing lights of the car, I saw somebody running towards the trees. It was a woman wearing some kind of tunic, but something was very strange. Her legs, they were bent backwards, like a dog's legs. It almost seemed like she was running backwards, but it couldn't be. Imagine somebody running towards the trees with their legs backwards. Seeing this almost made me pass out. I let the alarm continue until it turned off on its own. Then I went to the side of the door. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen, and I couldn't stop shaking. I'm not sure what happened, but I guess I fell asleep right there by the door. The first rays of sunlight came at a distant sound. An engine, the sound of an old car making a lot of noise. I could hear it from afar because the mountains carry the echo for miles. One of the workers from the previous day arrived, joined by some of the locals from the neighboring village, who had come to help finish the work in one day. One of them noticed my dark circles and told me that as long as I stayed out here alone, I would continue not sleeping. At that moment, I couldn't ask him more because he started working. However, at lunchtime, I found out that the 3 people from the village were somewhat surprised that I had stayed alone. I'm not sure why, but I ended up telling them what I had seen. Normally, in any other moment of my life, I would have felt embarrassed to share what happened to me, but at that moment I couldn't hold it in. One of them even nodded as if he understood me. When I described what I saw near the car, they confirmed that I had encountered something evil. However, what they told me next almost made me leave the entire country. They said that this wouldn't be the only thing that I would come across. While we were talking more, I realized something. Whatever it was had to have approached the car to set off the alarm. And this car, like all company cars, had a front and rear camera recording with motion detection. I couldn't wait to return to the city that same afternoon and review the recording, hoping to see whatever it was, to find out if it was real. It's very strange to confront things you can't explain. Something that shows you that there's a whole world of unexplained things out there. That terrible night in the cabin, the night that I believe I saw things that were not natural. We finished working around 5 p.m. and set out on the way back to the city. All the workers from the village seemed to be nervous about being there all day. I don't know what happened as the hours passed, but later it was a feeling that was also seen among everybody, even those who came from the city and didn't know any of the stories surrounding that area, those mountains. Nothing happened for the rest of the day, and we headed out of this creepy-ass place. We stopped in the village on our way back and invited everyone to eat because no one had done so until then. The local guys ate with us before heading back to their home. I was very lucky to get their contacts because hours later, when I got to the office, I received a text message from the contractor saying that if they were needed again, they wouldn't go to the cabin. The excuse was that it was too far. They had a contract with us, which they were risking by refusing, and they had already gone to different places even further away. Everything, the whole situation was very strange. I took the car's camera to check if anything happened, but they told me it wasn't working. That was obviously a lie because we always checked it. So I ended up asking the tech support guy to give it a detailed check, saying that I really needed those images from the previous night, and he promised that he would recover them. The following days, I was so focused on other properties that I almost forgot the awful experience I had at that place. That's until my boss told me that someone was interested, and I had to show them the cabin. He also wanted me to take his son Andres with me so that he could gain some experience. Andres was a good, extremely intelligent guy, despite being only 19 years old. Even though most people thought that he was only working there because he was the owner's son, I had the chance to talk with him since we started on the same day. I truly believe he had inherited his parents' talents. I was also grateful that I didn't have to go back alone. It would have been crazy to tell my boss I was afraid of a cabin. It never even crossed my mind to tell him. Maybe that's why it was easy for him to tell me that he had 2 more clients scheduled for the following day, and he suggested that we stay overnight in the cabin to avoid a return trip. Great. I got ready this time around. I brought extra gasoline in case the generator failed or ran out. I carried a hunting knife that belonged to my father, and I also took a small cross that was blessed in the Vatican, which was actually my mother's most prized relic. I took it from the house without telling her, because I doubted she would lend it to me without explaining why I needed it. Andres picked me up in his dad's truck, an all-terrain vehicle built to withstand anything, which actually made me feel a little safe. However, since it wasn't a company vehicle, it didn't have the camera. It was a very nice day for the trip, but as soon as we left the city and arrived at the village, we noticed the black edge of a storm approaching. I called my boss from there and I told him it was likely that we would be hit by heavy rain, and I asked him if he was sure that the potential clients would still come despite that. He said yes, and I mentioned feeling a bit risky about it, and he replied that he had actually let us use his truck to avoid any excuses. I had no excuse. It was time to continue. I tried, without sounding scared, explained to Andres how strange this place was. Maybe I wouldn't have done it, but I felt obligated to notify the local guys that I would be at the cabin again and to let them know. They reassured me, if anything happens, go to the areas with signal, and we'll come. That actually made me feel calm. Andres was a bit skeptical. He was actually making fun of me, but I didn't want to say anything. I prefer to think that nothing would happen, and that I would come across as crazy, rather than him realizing how creepy that place could be. From that point on, I drove because I knew the road, and it was going to get tricky once we entered the dirt road. Almost like it was destined to be. The first drops of rain began to fall. We moved slowly and the rain was still very light. Andres rolled down his window, and so did I. It felt nice. The truck was built for this, so we weren't worried about getting wet. We stopped to enjoy the rain, but then I started to feel something I don't remember feeling before. With each meter that we advanced, it felt like we were heading towards danger, almost like we were walking into the mouth of a wolf, into the gates of hell. That's funny, Andres said. What's funny? I asked. If you look closely towards the trees, it feels like there's people among there, almost like there are faces emerging from the branches, he replied. I looked to the sides, and after a few seconds, I noticed it too. It wasn't like there were real people there. It was more like there was something in the forest, as if there were ghostly figures standing among the trees. But it seemed like an illusion caused by the movement. I can't describe the relief I felt when I realized that there wasn't really any people standing there, watching us. When we got to the point where there was cell signal, I stopped and got out of the truck. I tied a ribbon to a tree, a golden ribbon. I told Andres that in case of an emergency, this was the only spot for miles where he could call for help and communicate with anybody outside of this. Alright, I'll come running back here to talk with my girlfriend, he said, pointing to his backpack where he had, indeed, running clothes. We continued the journey and finally arrived at the cabin. We got out of the truck and I stayed to unload my things while Andres went ahead with the keys. However, a few meters from the porch, he stopped, staring inside. I grabbed my backpack and stopped next to him. You feel it too? He asked. Yes, I replied. There's someone inside. It was strange. We could both sense it. We entered. Even though we checked every inch of the cabin, we felt like someone was here. Just as the rain started to pour even more, the client's truck arrived. However, it wasn't the interested party himself, but two people who worked for him. A man in his 40s with the appearance of an old movie accountant, and a young woman of about 25, small and thin, but with a much more imposing presence. From the communication, we realized that she was in charge of all the decisions. Sorry that our boss couldn't come, but he does trust any decision that we make. He asked us to check a few things, and if everything meets the requirements, he'll end up coming with an offer, she said. We had no reason not to believe them. The interested party was the owner of a chain of a regional retail store. They quickly glanced around the inside of the cabin, and without asking us a single question, went outside. It almost seemed like their boss cared more about the surroundings. The man went into the forest, and the woman asked us for some reason to show her where the septic tank was located. It was very strange, but we assumed these were normal details that they were interested in. We stood on the porch waiting for them. The rain started pouring, but it didn't seem to bother them. I noticed Andres was looking towards the trees at the spot where I thought I had seen the woman the first time. And I kid you not, the same thing was there. Look, it looks like there's a woman standing there, I said. There is a woman standing there, dude, he replied, very serious. He grabbed my shoulder to stop me from moving, insisting that I pay attention. I noticed how that face, which seemed to be formed by chance among the branches, had moved. It turned to the side and disappeared into the trees. Before we could do anything, we heard the man returning through the trees from the opposite direction that we were looking. He shouted to the woman that everything was ready and that he had found it. We didn't understand what he meant. The woman approached them and asked if everything was ready. He replied yes, everything was there, whatever it was. She turned to me and said that her boss would contact my boss. No, he needs to negotiate with me, I responded. No, they have to negotiate with me, she replied firmly, and without saying anything else, they headed back to the truck. The man approached us and asked if we were staying the night, and if we wanted to drive together to the village. We're actually gonna stay. We have to show the cabin again tomorrow, but thank you, I said. Look man, we're actually gonna make an offer, but don't stay here, he said, sounding concerned, or at least that's how it seemed like. Thanks, you can make an offer, but we're expecting one from a client who already visited, and also the response from tomorrow's clients. Try to contact Carlos as soon as possible to give you priority. He's actually in charge of the sale, I said, trying to sound confident. Y'all two take care on the way back, Andres also said, trying to sound professional. No one had ever visited the cabin before, and we weren't sure what would happen the next day, but it was a good technique. It put us back in the spot of making the actual decision. Do you really think they'll scare us away so we won't show it tomorrow? Andres asked once the man left. Imagine bringing a woman to stand far away to scare us, thinking we believe in the paranormal. Andres grabbed his phone and raincoat, and he told me he wouldn't take long. He was gonna walk to the area with a signal to talk to his girlfriend. I told him it was very far on foot, but he said he liked the rain and the mountains and would be fine. I looked at him as he walked away, but I ran to catch up with him. I handed him the hunting knife and I asked him to take it with him. After I lost sight of him, I went to the truck and got the cross. Somehow, I felt like it protected me more than the actual knife. It was getting dark, and that's when I heard a strange sound coming from the back of the cabin, among the trees, like an animal, but a huge one, almost like a bull, or something like that. I then heard the branches move, almost like something very tall was walking through them. I ran back to the truck, and I parked it closer to the cabin, ensuring it was nearby in case of any emergency. When I got out of the truck, I went inside the cabin, I closed the door, and for some reason, I felt like I needed to look through the window, and that's when I saw it. A figure among the trees. Keep in mind it was almost completely dark outside, and just like that, it disappeared. At this point I was questioning myself if I was going crazy. I sat down for a few minutes, trying to figure out what the hell was going on, and as I was sitting in the cabin, that's when I heard footsteps outside. I figured it was Andres who had came back already, or chose to come back instead of continuing on. But that's when I noticed that the rain had stopped. As I peered out the window to see who was outside, that's when I saw it. Not one, not two, 3 or 4, but 5 figures among the trees. At least 5 from what I remember, moving as if surrounding the cabin. I couldn't tell if they were naked, but they seemed to be from that distance in the darkness. There were some smaller ones and others that were tall, like men and women. Then, I noticed one of them deviated from the trees and started walking towards the cabin. At that moment, the motion sensor light outside activated, and I could see him much more clear now. He was wearing a crown of thorns, and he was bleeding from the forehead. It was obvious that this man was dressed like Jesus. As soon as the light hit his face, he took a few steps back, and then I heard a car approaching in the distance. The man disappeared, but when the car arrived, I recognized the people inside, workers from the village. In the back seat, Andres was lying down, completely pale, as if he had seen a ghost. I hurried to greet them, but Andres ran past me, ignoring me, and rushed into the cabin. They parked the truck next to mine, almost touching the stairs. They even backed it up as if ready to leave at full speed. I wanted to ask what was happening, but they told me to get inside quickly without wasting time. And we did, and they started checking all the windows. "Do you have enough gas in the generator to last all night?" one of them asked me. "I do, but what's going on?" I replied. They signaled for me to stay silent, turned off all the lights except the one at the entrance, which didn't face the path. They waited for Andres to come out of the bathroom, and then we all went into the office. They turned off the desk lamp, leaving us in complete darkness. With the office door open, I hear any sounds from outside. Someone knocked on the door. Andres seemed out of it, despite the workers signaling for me not to. I left the office. Not that I was trying to be a hero, but I wanted to keep everybody safe. I crawled across the floor of the cabin until I could see the door. The light outside seemed to have gone out. The knocking continued. I moved through the cabin, trying to figure out how many people were outside. I couldn't hear anything, and the door didn't seem to open despite the knocking. It was as if something had touched the door and then disappeared. I started crawling across the living room to get to a window where I thought I could see the entrance. That's when I started getting this terrifying feeling, a feeling of being frozen and numb, as if my body was starting to go to sleep, and I started struggling to respond. I stopped in the middle of the living room, the most exposed part. I looked up at the window that I was trying to get to, and that's when I saw something clearly, despite the darkness. A woman at the window. It didn't close completely, and through that small gap, something was trying to poke its head through. staring at me. The only way to describe her is that she looked very demonic. That's when I screamed. They all said that I screamed very loud, but I don't remember. I only remember ending up with broken nails and splintered hands, somehow dragging myself back to the office. The next thing I remember was about half an hour later. I couldn't speak. They say that I kept screaming, and that Andres was also in a terrible state, looking for the keys, telling everybody that we had to go. They started laughing, saying, "We won't get far. All the roads disappear at these hours. We should stay here a bit. Maybe in the meantime, they'll leave." I didn't understand what they meant, but that's when one of the workers said to come look out the window, and it'll make sense. That's when we saw figures walking away slowly, taking one step every few seconds. Among them, I thought I saw the woman from the window. She was wearing a mantle similar to the Virgen of Guadalupe, but black and gold. I saw it clearly and connected it to the man dressed like Jesus. I didn't understand what kind of strange, crazy people were around here, where they came from, or what they wanted from us. I had so many questions. Why were the workers there if they were so afraid of these mountains and roads? Why did they even come for us? Could I even trust them? There was no reason for them to lie. They knew we would be here because I had notified them. I know it was a good choice to tell them this because they kept an eye on the cars heading from the village to the mountain. They started telling us that they saw the clients who went to see the cabin for the buyer. When they passed by, they only noted the vehicle. However, when they returned, they arrived at their shop with a scratched and dusty truck, branches stuck to the front. It looked like they had driven through bushes rather than the actual road. The truck was also extremely hot and steaming from the engine, as if it was an old or damaged vehicle, but it was actually quite new. They said that when they saw it going up, it was in perfect condition. That's when the man who got out of it collapsed on the ground, and the woman that was driving asked them to check the damage and to see if they could make it to the city. They asked what happened, and the young woman asked them to just fix the truck enough so they could continue their journey. She walked away to make a phone call. The man that was with her began to catch his breath and told him an animal had crossed their path, causing them to veer off the road and fall into a shallow ravine. Fortunately, the truck managed to climb out with its four-wheel drive. The animal had followed them for some time. Well, there are very few deer around here. I don't know what kind of animal could have made you veer off the road and then follow you through the brush, one of the workers replied. Are you sure it was an animal? Well, what else could it be? The man said, seeming to get agitated just by the memory. We were driving normally when it came at us. It was on two legs, but it wasn't a person. It wasn't a woman, even though it looked like one. Its face was snout, demonic-like. He didn't even have to describe it more. They already knew what he was talking about. Knowing the stories of what supposedly happened to outsiders who venture into the forest. Everyone in the village knew the stories, but very few had actually experienced them. Apparently, even fewer had seen her, if you could actually call her that. But the ones who would often suffer, especially those who came from outside. They couldn't understand why there was so much traffic heading to that area despite the stories. Maybe nobody believed in what the villagers would tell them. I'm not even sure why they chose to come for us. Maybe they liked me, or maybe they knew that I was going to have more work there. When they heard the couple's story about what had forced them off the road, they finished fixing the truck, closed the shop, and headed to the cabin. Far from the area with cell signal, closer to the highway, someone suddenly crossed their path. They were driving slowly, alert because it was getting dark, when something jumped in front of their truck. It was Andres, asking for help, terrified, saying over and over that something was following him and that they should turn back and head to the village. But they told him that he couldn't leave me alone there, convincing him to return to the cabin. As they drove, They said that they saw several people approaching from the same direction, not ghostly figures, but actual people walking towards the cabin where I was waiting. These people didn't react to their presence. However, Andres was terrified because he had seen something very different. They arrived at the cabin just in time and were now ready to spend the rest of the night with us. No one leaves the forest at those hours, and now we're there just waiting. After a while, these figures that had tried to enter the cabin, or at least had approached to knock, had started moving away. Who were those strange people? What were they actually doing there? Not even the workers could explain it. Suddenly, we heard something in the distance, and Andres ran to hide underneath the bed. I'm not lying, he actually ran to hide like a kid, followed by the others who pulled me with them, all scared. Their calm demeanor had completely disappeared. "She's here, she's here, she's here," they repeated, even though everything was locked and we had secured the windows. We all hid underneath the bed like children. Whatever was outside, it felt different. Underneath the bed, Andres had stopped responding. He had passed out, and our instincts were telling us that we were in the presence of something horrible. Then, there was some kind of crying, something that made it clear that it wasn't an animal, for no animal in the world sounds like that. But I know it wasn't human. And then suddenly, everything felt different. I'm not even sure how to explain it, but there was a silence that felt almost like tranquilizing. I stood up with one of the workers, and we approached the door. Somehow, the fact that we were no longer in fear from moments before indicated that it was no longer near. It's like you could feel it inside your chest when it was there, but now it wasn't. We stepped outside and it seemed like there was very little air. We couldn't hear anything, and it was very difficult to breathe. We managed to wake up Andres and got together near the door, ready to run to the vehicles if anything else happened. However, Andres looked very fragile. I felt like he couldn't handle another situation, and I was actually worried for him. I suddenly touched my pocket, and I realized I no longer had my cross. It wasn't with me. I started looking for it all over the cabin, under the bed, on the bed, but it wasn't there. My mind started to clear as I retraced my steps from that night. Then it hit me. We still had to show the cabin the next day. I couldn't return to my boss with just a ghost story. I had to convince Andres not to say anything. We would be made fun of. No one would believe us. I would probably get fired, even if all of us told the same story. Andres fell asleep with a fever, and he started sweating as well. I tried to convince the workers to stay at least until the morning, to just pretend to do some repairs and wait while we showed the cabin. I couldn't leave without doing it, and I didn't want to be left alone if they ended up taking Andres. I convinced them by offering to pay them, as if they had done some repair work. After a few minutes of them talking between themselves, they agreed. By the way, it was only 2 workers. That night was terrifying. Also, there are 2 things I want you to understand. 2 things that I haven't shared yet, and that I don't want to share with the general public. That's the name of the workers. Why? Well, they still live in the village, and it could be dangerous for them if revealed. And the name that the locals gave to this thing that's in here in the forest, well, it's a name that they told me only once that night. And they clearly said that it should never be repeated, especially not outside of here. Anyways, the night went on and we didn't even sleep. As dawn approached, I thought everything had passed, at least for that night. However, something else happened. Just as the other presence had made me feel fear when it was nearby, I had this feeling to look from the window. When I did, I saw it from behind a tree trunk. It was hairless, very pale. The features, the eyes, the nose, and the mouth looked more like black smudges. It was something very strange that seemed more like a vision that you get when you don't sleep. I told the workers to come look at the window, and they did. It was strange. I can't assure you that it happened, but we thought we saw it peek and then run towards the mountain, and it was still naked and thin. That's when the worker said that whenever dawn approaches, there was always somebody heading up to the mountain. They said that's why people come from far away for the door. When I asked what they meant, they only answered that they were talking about the door to hell. It was strange, to say the least. I can describe it somehow, knowing about this belief. I'm not saying that I think it's true. I swear on my children's lives that even I don't know what to believe. Even if I were in your place, listening to the story, I wouldn't believe it. That's why it's so difficult to share it. But I think that no one shares their experiences when something happens that goes beyond a paranormal situation, like hearing voices or seeing a dead relative at home. People are comfortable believing in that, but not something more. Even though the world is full of evil things, spirits and everything, proving it to us every day and every night. Everything changed when I realized I was sleeping a few feet from a door to hell, and yet nothing was happening. The last minutes of darkness that night were peaceful. When the dawn came, we had breakfast with coffee and cookies, the only thing that we had available. By 9 o'clock, the two workers started cleaning around the septic tank in the back, pretending to do some repairs. Right at 9, we saw two new black current year model trucks arrive. The windows had that super dark tint that you couldn't see inside. We knew right away that these might be very special clients. I approached them a few feet to welcome them. Andres was still very unwell, trying to compose himself inside the cabin. From one of the trucks, a short man with a military haircut got out, and he walked to the second truck, where someone rolled down the window slightly. He made a signal and two more men got out of the first truck. It was clear to me now that they looked more like bodyguards or military personnel than assistants, unlike the ones from the previous day. They said they would inspect the place. I tried to give them some information about the purchase options, but they said everything was already arranged. "Do you want to hear a tune?" the first man who got out asked with a smile, referring to a hit song by the singer who owned the place. Honestly, I said I didn't. His smile faded, and they headed to the back. Another man with the same look got out of the truck and stayed back, and started walking towards the forest. At that moment, I realized that they were looking for the same thing as the previous clients, but that only raised more questions about this place, about what it was, and what could actually be out here. As I continued looking, the somewhat friendly bodyguard approached me again. "Do you think it will interest your boss?" he asked. "People have shown a lot of interest," I said. Without responding, he walked into the cabin where Andres was still pale, sitting in the living room. "Is he alright?" he asked, sounding concerned. Andres, still in a terrible state, looked up and nodded weakly. "Does he need anything?" the bodyguard asked. He replied that everything was fine. The guy continued walking, closing the door behind him. He didn't even try to hide what he was doing. He started kicking the floor as if searching for something. Then, he opened the door and told me, "Crazy people, huh?" He kept smiling and left. I didn't even dare ask him anything. When I stepped out, I saw two of the bodyguards checking the workers' credentials. I told them everything was fine and that they were trustworthy. "Alright then," they said, handing back the credentials. They all returned to the trucks except for the one who had stayed with me in front of the cabin. I thought he was going to make small talk or ask a question, but he just stood there with a mocking smile. I think he knew I had thousands of questions for him, but I didn't dare ask. That's when someone whistled from the trees. The guy from the other truck, the one who had gotten out later, approached and handed something to the man in charge. Then he walked towards me standing next to Andres and the two workers. Did any of you lose this? He asked, holding out a cross that was covered in dirt. My mother's cross. It looked like it was buried for a long time, old and worn, and even had some mold on it. Yeah, it's mine, I said. Be careful where you leave these things around here, he said, getting too close to me. He added something in a seemingly friendly tone, but it sounded like a threat to me as well. Don't show it to anyone else, and leave this place. You don't want anything to do with fixing things here anymore. Get to an area with cell signal. My boss will take care of the purchase. He got into the truck. As they turned around to leave, he rolled down the window and motioned for me to come closer. I don't mean this in a bad way, but leave and take your commission. I actually spent a night alone out here. His eyes widened. You been here since last night? Then take your things and get out of here. Go slowly so you can catch up to us. I'm not sure why, but he seemed sincere. I told the others to pack everything, and we ended up leaving quickly, especially Andres and me, knowing that we wouldn't have to return if it was sold. We sped up as much as we could, as much as the road allowed. It felt like it was disappearing at times. We ended up following closely behind them on the dirt road, and once we reached the highway, they drove off as if it were an emergency, and we lost sight of them. I called my boss and found out that there were already 2 offers on the table. The first from the previous day's clients, but he said we had to accept this latest one. I didn't even want to ask why. Once I got off the phone, I tried to talk to Andres, trying to calm him down before we headed back to the village. We arrived at the village and one of the workers offered to let us rest for a while there. I ended up leaving Andres sleeping, hoping that he would feel better. But people were friendly. Well, they always been. In these remote, smaller villages in Mexico, everyone seems to get right along and be treated like family. The worker who let us stay in their home went to his shop, leaving us in the care of Don Teo, his father. He was an older man but still strong, with a rancher's build. He was very kind, setting up a place for Andres to rest. Don Teo said that I should let him be alone, and to take a look around at the shops and the stands. I found a table on the sidewalk where a lady was selling some homemade food, and I ordered something without thinking twice. She was selling some gorditas. The lady sat with me as I ate. Did you come to see her too? Are you here to ask for something? If you did, don't do it. The last ones who came never came back. They were the ones who always came staying all night. But one day, they didn't come back. We knew they were important because the army and helicopters came looking for them, but they were never found. As the lady spoke, it started to rain, so she moved me to a table under a small roof in her yard. The village was set up to where someone's house was basically their store as well, with stands right in front of their porch. With the rain, the few people on the street went inside, disappearing from sight. I finished my meal and was ready to leave. I didn't want to hear anything that this lady had to say. I just wanted to sleep. I was exhausted. But that's when the shouts of Don Teo got my attention. He's gone. The boy is gone. I ran towards where the shouting was coming from and saw that our truck was no longer there. Andres had left in it. How was I going to get back? What was I going to tell his father? Besides, he didn't look too well to be driving safe. I quickly asked Don Teo how I could get to the city to try to catch up with him. He looked at me and said he didn't head to the city. He went back up towards the cabin. How is that possible? I said. He couldn't have done that. I didn't want to go back up there. Not again. I asked Don Teo if Andres had said anything before he left, and he told me that Andres had woken up clutching his chest, asking for his medallion. I then remembered the medallion of the Virgin Mary that Andres always wore, given to him by his late grandmother as he had said. I couldn't believe he had gone back for it. It was like searching for a needle in a haystack. I asked Don Theo about his son, and he said he would be back soon from the shop. However, he did offer to take me up there. I must have looked so scared that he felt sorry for me, which is most likely why he helped. I mean, Don Theo looked up there in age. So we got into an old beat-up car that barely seemed to run, and very slowly, we began going up to the cabin. The wipers didn't work, so we moved at a snail's pace. We reached the end of the paved road and continued on the dirt path. Eventually, Don Theo said this was as far as he could go. The car wouldn't make it any further and would get stuck. I thanked him for helping me so much and got out. As I did, Don Theo told me, "Whatever you do, don't spend the night here." After about 20 minutes, I found myself at the familiar spot with cell signal. It wasn't yet 5 p.m., but it felt like the night could engulf the place at any moment. I ran through all the mud and puddles, and that's when I saw our truck. It was locked, which I took as a sign that Andres had left it that way. The thunder indicated that the storm was only going to get worse. As I kept running towards the cabin, I saw it from a distance. However, I slowed down before I made it to the tree line. On the porch of the cabin, I saw something. It was that woman. That horrible, disfigured woman. She was sitting at the front porch. She was looking down, but I could tell she was smirking. I hid behind a tree, peering out cautiously. I realized I was at the very tree from where those things had been watching the house. I looked around nervously, feeling like all hell was going to break loose. The cabin was not an option. There was no way I was going to go into that cabin, and I wasn't planning on getting any closer. And where the heck was Andres at? I had to get back with him, but there was nowhere to run. I had to find him. To be honest, I did want to head back, saying that it was his fault for coming back here, but I felt guilty. I couldn't leave without Andres. I couldn't abandon him. Could he be inside the cabin trapped? Did he go back and I missed him on the way here? One thing was for sure. I wasn't going to go inside the cabin, not with this creepy lady in the porch waiting. So I left. I didn't know what to do. Maybe he's on the way back to the vehicle and I can catch up to him. And worst case scenario is that I end up trapped up here alone in the rainy night. What stupid decision did I make? I should have just waited for him at the truck, or left a note on the truck or something. I then started panicking. Fuck, I gotta make it back before he leaves. That's when I started running back. The storm was approaching quickly, and the forest was becoming darker. I kept moving, calling out for Andres, but only the sound of the wind and distant thunder responded. The trees were swaying, and I continued, and I swear I would see shadows in between the trees. After what felt like an eternity, I saw a faint light in the distance. It was coming from a small clearing up ahead. I approached quietly, my heart pounding, and there, in the middle of the clearing, was Andres. He was holding his medallion and looking confused and scared. "Andres!" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. He turned, relief washing over his face when he saw me. "Thank God," he whispered, clutching the medallion tightly. "I found it, thanks to her," pointing to his medallion. "But I got lost on the way back." "We need to get out of here," I said, grabbing his arm and guiding him back through the forest. The storm was almost upon us, and the path seemed to be even more rocky on the way back. We hurried as fast as we could. The storm broke, rain started pouring down, and thunder started cracking overhead, but it felt like a relief compared to what we had just been through. However, those feelings of relief quickly faded when I thought I saw people walking in the same direction as us, figures among the trees next to us. I know it wasn't my imagination, because Andres was also seeing it. We started running as fast as we could, before realizing that we should have got into the truck by now. Instead, we ended up coming close to a ravine. Damn it, where are we? We stopped for a second and looked around. I could see with the remaining light a canyon at its bottom, something that looked like a cave, and right in front of it, I saw silhouettes of people. There were about 13 of them, holding hands and forming a circle. Then there were 6 more holding hands and forming another circle around the first 3. And then more and more circles. I couldn't count how many there was, but there were 6 circles of people, one inside the other. We started running again towards what we assumed to be where the truck was at. At this point, we both said screw the truck, and if we have to run all the way to the village, so be it. As we were running, about 50 meters behind us, I turned to see if any of those things were following us. Well, of course they were. Why did I even look back? At the strike of a lightning flash, I saw something running towards us on that very same path. It was the woman, the one with the fucked up legs, running right after us, with her head sideways, almost like it was falling, smirking. I'm not sure what I believe anymore, or what I saw, because even Andres didn't confirm. But I swear that the woman looked almost skeletal, as if she barely had skin, or like if it was rotting, like a running corpse. I convinced myself I was just imagining, just the light from the lightning, that I saw nothing. That's when we started praying to all the saints, to God, to our Mother of Christ to guard us from all this evil. And Andres started screaming, Dios mío, por favor ayúdame. God, please, help us. I could hear the sound of her running behind us, getting closer. And that's when I heard the scream that still haunts me to this day, a demonic scream. At this point, I just closed my eyes as I knew we were about to be taken to I don't know where. And that's when I heard a voice behind us. It was her. She whispered,
Te veré en tus sueños. I'll see you in your dream.
And just like that, the running sounds behind us ceased. I looked back and nobody was there. Suddenly ahead, I saw some lights that brought me back to life. They were the lights of a patrol vehicle, or so we thought at first. But as we got closer, we realized it was a rescue ambulance. We ran to them, begging for help, screaming. Don Teo was standing there beside our truck with 2 paramedics. At this point, Andres was yelling for help as we got to the clearing. The paramedics checked us, attended to us, and one of them took the keys to our truck and drove it behind the ambulance back to the village. We were trembling so much we couldn't have driven. We were in the back of the truck. Alright, let me explain. This isn't like the States. We're in a remote village where the ambulance is not a covered van. This was a makeshift truck with a high tarp over the bed. Don Teo had mentioned that he had to beg and beg for responders to go up to the cabin, as it was forbidden. But the ambulance that the village uses might have been able to go, and he pretty much had to convince them to come. I told the paramedic about the people we saw, that there were a whole bunch of people back there, like some secret cult or something. No, brother, he said. Nadie va allá arriba. No one goes up there anymore. All the roads are closed. The last ones who went up there never came back down. We got to the village. They waited for us to ensure we could drive, as we were ready to leave at that moment, after calming down a bit. They were trying to convince us to spend the night. We kept insisting we saw people, swearing we saw something very strange as well. The young paramedic who drove our truck, a medical intern, said, Look, I'll be honest, we don't believe in that stuff, but we can tell you what the locals have told us. They say those people are dead, strange folks who used to come here, and then suddenly stopped returning. They said that their souls went into that cave, through the door as they call it, but their bodies stayed around here. People say that the cave is a portal to hell. Andres was shaking his head as the intern spoke. I know what you're thinking. They're just stories or legends. But that's what they say. They say that those bodies move every night, so they are never found. We then went back to Don Teo's house. I thanked him for his help, and we rested for a while, trying to shake off everything that just happened. Andres was still shaken. but he was slowly getting better. We did spend the night there, as it was pretty dark to head back to the city at that time. The next morning, we left early, determined to never return to that cabin again. My boss told us that the sale was finalized. I didn't even ask any more questions, just glad anything to do with this fucked up cabin was finally done. It was around midnight when I finally dropped off Andres at his house. Everything in the city seemed strange to me, almost surreal, as if nothing could scare me anymore. I was grateful to see this side of life. We never did go back to the cabin again. I was able to get the pictures that I requested from the guy that was in charge of all the cameras. I'm gonna try to take a picture of it and share more information with you, but it's gonna have to wait until I finally resign to start my own business in the same field. Me and Andres did go to church for the next few weekends, trying to receive blessings and cleansings from the priest, which do seem to work as nothing happened after that. However, there is one thing that still scares me to this day, and that's every time that I'm gonna go to sleep, I hear those words, the words of that lady.
Te veré en tus sueños. I'll see you in your dream.
We had a tradition of going to see my grandfather every summer and spend some time at his cabin. The cabin by a lake, and older than he is. The cabin is a load of fun for a child spending their carefree summer. The one thing I disliked about the cabin was there was no indoor washroom. A shower was set up outside. An outhouse a few steps off into the woods was the worst thing about the cabin. I hated using that thing. Bugs always took over the inside, and I had a fear of something reaching up to grab me if I sat down. We begged my grandfather to get indoor plumbing. He only got a tub hooked up, but his water heater can only handle so much, so we were banned from using it in the summer. The place was just barely held together. It would be cheaper to buy a new cabin than to renovate it, but we still went every year, always forgetting the negatives, until we finally arrived. Even my father complained about the outhouse, and he never really complained about anything. My grandfather also had a rack of hunting rifles and one shotgun. He told all of us to never touch them, and to respect the weapons. He left the cabinet they were inside locked, his guns unloaded, and the ammo hidden somewhere in the cabin. He took no chances with the guns around a bunch of kids. He always said he would whoop some ass if he ever saw us touching them, and told us it was because he loved us and didn't want an accident to happen. I asked why he kept the guns. I didn't see him using them very often aside from shooting a deer or two. I would see him go off into the woods while we swam with a rifle on his shoulder, but he normally never came back with some animal he shot. I don't think he would kill something to waste, leaving it behind. Or did I think he was a bad shot? He may walk slowly, but his eyesight was better than ours. He always knew what might be going on. One time, my cousin found a cigarette someone dropped near the corner store, where we sometimes got ice cream snacks. He kept it hidden for a day. When he thought that the coast was clear, he used one of the lighters for the fire pit. He didn't even take a drag before our grandfather came out yelling at him, scaring us all to death. With 3 kids crying, begging him not to tell our parents, he gave us mercy. As long as we cleaned the boat we've been putting off all weekend. Overall, my grandfather was a scary man. One night, after telling each other ghost stories to freak each other out, the worst thing happened. When everyone else was dead asleep, I needed to use the restroom. I hated going out at night. It might be only a few steps, and yet it felt like a mile walk. Things croaked off in the woods, which were perfectly normal noises for a forest. When you're a kid, full of ghost stories and listening to these things, those noises turned into killers and ghosts waiting to scoop you up. I went through the cabin to the back door, knowing that I couldn't hold it until morning. There was a flashlight by the door. I turned it on only to have it flicker off. It was the kid's job to make sure the flashlight had new batteries. Sometimes we switched them to out the good ones in the shared Game Boy for a few more hours of playtime. It finally came back to bite us. However, since the full moon was out, I had taken the path 100 times before, so I went on without the flashlight. I feared what my grandfather would do if I woke him up trying to find new batteries. Slipping on my shoes, I went off in the backyard and down the short path to use the washroom. I heard a noise, and I looked over my shoulder and walked faster, fearing what might be looking at me in the dark. That was a mistake. Going without a flashlight and not paying attention to where I was going could have killed me that night. The longer I walked, the more afraid I was. It should not take this long to get to the outhouse. Another crack of a twig made me jump. I could no longer hold it and needed to step off the path to do my business and carry on. I hated going to the washroom out in the woods. At least it was quick, and I was back on the path towards the cabin. But was I? Nothing looked right. The trail appeared too overgrown. I didn't understand how I had gone so far off the path. In my mind, I went the right way the entire time, and I only got lost when I stepped aside. Fear nearly froze me to the spot, forcing my body to move. I started going down where I thought I had came from, praying to find the path again. At this point, I called out for someone to come and get me. A sound came, and I shut my mouth. Heart beating so fast that it hurt. I looked around trying to see what was stalking a poor scared kid in the dark. Something flew at me. Wings flapping and a screeching cry made me snap. That's when I ran, screaming, trying to get away from whatever this thing was. Only when I stopped running and was very lost, I realized I just got scared by a bat. Just a normal, harmless bat. I wanted to cry, unless someone noticed I wasn't in my sleeping bag when they woke up to go to the bathroom as well. No one would know I was missing until morning. How long would it take until someone did notice? I skip breakfast pretty often. They might even assume I was just sleeping in. I didn't want to stay out in the woods overnight, having no other options or ideas of what to do while lost. I kept walking while trying to force back my tears. I had forgot it was best to stay in one spot while being lost in the woods. Just going deeper in them wasn't the best idea. I felt cold, scared, and was getting bit by bugs. My heart almost broke over the idea of being out there forever, starving to death, and no one ever knowing what happened. Thinking back to the books I needed to read in school, I wonder if I could live out in the woods until they found me. If I find clean water and could figure out how to make a fire, I might be able to. The issue being, I never actually started a fire without a lighter. I tried with sticks, but it always took too long, and we always gave up. Me and my cousins loved burning things and were impatient. There was always a lighter to use. I wanted to try and find the cabin until the sun rose. If I still was in the woods by tomorrow night, I would buckle down to figure out how to make fire. Wait, wouldn't someone smell the smoke and find me sooner? Or would I burn the entire forest down? Getting motivated, I started to look for a clearing that I could use for a fire pit. It took a while, but I found a spot where the ground looked to be mostly dirt. It took longer to find a stone I could use to start digging out a hole in the dirt for my fire pit. My hands cold and the rock cut into my fingers a few times. Then, I needed to find the right sticks to get the fire started. And then finally, get enough wood to keep it going if I did get one started. I didn't go out of sight of the clearing, as I collected what I needed. Exhausted by the time I thought I was ready, my pit was filled with dry leaves and small sticks. I sat down ready to try to get a fire started. I used 2 sticks I peeled the bark off at first. My hands became raw from rubbing them together. Frustrated, I didn't think I could get them warm enough from the friction to get anything started. I then tried a rock method. I didn't know if any rocks would do, or if my grandfather had a special type in his fire starting kit. A miracle of the night happened when I found the right rocks to smash together. One spark caught and I nearly fainted when the leaves burned and yet didn't catch fire. I kept trying until I had a very small flame that I actually fed with my breath. I've never been so proud of myself in my entire life. The smoke blew into my face, causing me to cough and eyes water. Still very happy for my very small fire though. There wasn't a way to tell how long I was out there for. The sun hadn't even risen yet, so at least a few hours. As I warmed myself by the flames, I heard something off in the distance of the woods. I heard it again. My chest got tight with hope when I recognized that the noises I was hearing were human voices. No one I knew, but still someone out here in the woods with me. With my fire still going, I would be able to see my way back to the clearing if needed. I hurried off towards the voices, so happy I couldn't speak.
Mine.
The voices were a warning for the person they were speaking with. It sounded strange, as if English wasn't their first language. Still, it was someone who could help. At least, that's what I thought. Rushing into another clearing, all my excitement faded when I saw what belonged to those voices. A dead, torn to pieces deer sat in the middle of the small clearing, blood soaking the grass and leaves. In the clear moonlight, I saw 3 pale things, figures, all hunched over in the deer, tearing in with their hands and teeth. All their limbs were skinny and far too long for their bodies. Each of them were pushing aside each other, trying to eat as much of the deer as they could. Skin pale and drawn tight against their bones, faces covered with blood. Each of them bald, with a mouth far too large for their face. And their eyes, oh God, their eyes were missing. Each of them had black empty sockets. None of them noticed me. That is, until I let out a scream. All 3 heads darted up. Now knowing there was some fresh prey, I turned to run. Sounds from behind me said they were all starting to chase me. Tears came to my eyes, making it nearly impossible to see where I was going. I slammed into a tree hard enough to hit my arm to the point I thought it was broken. I tumbled to the ground, crying in pain. My moment of weakness enough for one creature to get on top, limbs on either side. The head looking around trying to hear where I was. The large mouth opening, dripping blood on my tear-stained face. The moment before the mouth filled with teeth tore my face off, a loud cracking sound echoed through the forest. The creature blown off. I screamed even more when a powerful hand grabbed my shoulder to drag me to my feet. Grandpa. I choked up when I saw him clearly through my wet eyes. He was holding a shotgun, ready to fire again. His face stern, not afraid or surprised of the creatures. I expected them to attack us. They somehow knew what the gun could do. Grabbing their dead, they dragged it deeper into the darkness. The moment they were out of sight, I heard the worst noise. Awful sounds of bones cracking and breaking. They were eating the one my grandfather had shot. It was all too much for me. I broke down crying, my grandfather silently bending over to pick me up in one arm. As he carried me through the woods, he stomped out my small fire on the way out. He didn't scold me for crying or getting lost. Him actually comforting me that night was the kindest moment we ever shared together. We arrived back by the time the sun was rising. My mother and father awake and worried out of their mind. They scooped me up when we arrived, and I cried all over again. Before we left, I was able to get my grandfather alone to ask him what happened. Those things wouldn't bother us at the cabin. I only saw them because I went too far in the woods. Apparently, he had a deal with them, that they were not to touch any humans as long as he fed them, and he also wasn't sure how many of them lived in the woods, or even what they were. He also said that he fully understood if I didn't want to come back to the cabin next year. I almost didn't, until he passed away of natural causes. I spent parts of my summer at the cabin. He wasn't able to get an indoor toilet, but he did mark the path to the outhouse with those solar charged lamps that people use in their garden to make sure that no one ever goes off the path again.